Welcome, everybody, to another wonderful Winter Wonders. If you're in the room, please remember to silence your cell phones would be greatly appreciated. Zoomers, please stay muted. You can ask your questions at the end at questions and answers. So I'm going to call up Sheila Dickison, who's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Very good. Thanks, Pam. I hope you'll take note of the wonderful shirt that Chris is wearing, and there'll be a quiz at the end as to what vegetables he's advertising. Dr. Chris Gunter is a professor and chair of the Horticultural Sciences Department at UF. He leads a group of experts and programs that break new ground in research, plant breeding and genetics, fruit and vegetable production, and related disciplines that continue to shape the future of food in Florida and around the world. The Horticultural Sciences Department is the premier horticultural department in the country and is doing world-class research in this area of agriculture and plant sciences. Gunter comes to the UF IFAS from North Carolina State University, where he was a faculty member for 14 years. His previous role as director of graduate programs also involved sharing his vegetable production expertise through education and extension. And I wanted to share a quote here. When Chris was hired as chair a couple of years ago, Scott Engel, the UF Senior Vice President for Agriculture and Natural Resources, said in the press release, we're announcing his appointment in April of 2021. A world-class leader has been hired to support a world-class department. Dr. Gunter will assure that the department is there for the fruit and vegetable industry and an essential part of the economy of Florida. I know that our teaching, research, and extension programs will flourish under his leadership, and I know that they have. So Chris is Talking Tomatoes, knowledge, wisdom, and passion.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay if I stand at this mic like this? And hopefully those of you on Zoom can hear me. So I want to start, since I haven't been to Okamic before and I don't know the audience very well, I want to a little closer. Is that better? Okay. So tell me a little bit about your interest in vegetables. As Sheila mentioned, my role as a faculty member was in vegetable production, working with commercial vegetable producers, but I had a lot of interaction with people who were homeowners and passionate about vegetables. So is anybody here passionate about growing vegetables and has grown vegetables in a garden before? A few, okay. Anybody failed at gardening? Anybody's garden as frozen as mine is right now. So it's very crispy, yes. Oh, nice, good. Oh, good, okay. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my take on tomatoes from sort of the commercial side as well as the homeowner side, but then I wanna leave, I put way too much information in my slides, of course, so I'll leave a bunch of time to talk about that afterwards too, if you want, and I'll stay, and chat with you about that. So they mentioned already my background in commercial vegetable production. So what I did with commercial fruit and vegetable growers was help them answer really practical problems. So all of my research as a scientist, as a faculty member, was really designed to be applied to growers' problems. And so when they came to me as a researcher and asked me a question, why is this happening to my plants? What can I do about it? Then I would help them solve that problem either in their own field with research or on a research station where I could get a little more control of the science. And specifically, I did a lot of work with plant nutrition. For those of you who know about farming, farmers have lots of challenges. One of them was in the area of produce safety. You've probably seen a lot about food safety lately. I helped growers understand the risks associated with producing vegetables outside and growing them with our hands, which we often do. And then also inherent risks in the system, in the environment, like irrigation, water, and animal intrusion, things like that. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to recognize challenges? So Sheila mentioned I came from North Carolina. So what attracted me to North Carolina, the production there was the proximity to these huge population centers on the East Coast. If you know anything about commercial vegetable production, most of the vegetables that you're eating are produced in California, serving this huge population center and then being trucked across to serve this one. The challenge with that is when gas prices go up, this looks much less attractive. Production south and closer to those centers looks much more attractive. So when you see gas prices rise, farmers aren't necessarily sad, because it usually means markets are opening. So just, there's always, a silver lining in those headlines. Florida is a little bit unique because all of our production happens when everybody else is not producing. So the further south we go, the more these production areas start to fuel this production center and beyond, when there are no other fruits and vegetables on the marketplace, right? So those of you who are eating strawberries, those are probably local strawberries now, because the Central Florida strawberry production season is on, and those are starting to show up now in our markets. So, but we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about tomatoes. So let me tell you about what I did with tomatoes. I mentioned mineral nutrition. So have you ever opened a tomato and seen this yellow color at the top? When you see that, the work that we did, research we did, showed that this is actually not a ripening problem, but instead this is a problem associated with low potassium. So if I could increase the potassium available to the plant, I could alleviate the symptoms of this, this disorder. So very practical, very applied. The problem was, before we knew that, what farmers were doing was waiting for those tomatoes that had that yellow shoulder to ripen. The problem is that yellow area is never going to ripen. It's physically not possible for it to turn red because of that potassium deficiency. So what ends up happening is, as they wait, the fruit that would have been harvestable becomes rotten and over mature and unmarketable. So saving dollars by doing research is what we do in horticultural science. And then we distribute that information directly to farmers in lots of ways, including field days, bulletins, talks at meetings, things like that. So we try to do a lot of that to get that information from our research out there for farmers. I already mentioned irrigation work. This is a real world farm. So if this is the water that you're going to spray over the top of your tomatoes or lettuce, and the next place it's going to go is to your kitchen, I can tell you that that's an inherent risk we want to try to avoid, right? And so helping farmers understand that that's a risk, not because the cows aren't cute and frolicking, but because they are doing their cow business in that water and then spreading those microbes that are inherent in their gut to our produce. That can be a real challenge. The other thing I got to do as a faculty member is transfer my passion for vegetable production to students. Anybody here been a teacher? Any teachers? Okay, I know you're sheepish now, so a few of you are going to admit to being teachers. So the passion that I brought to the classroom, I really did experiential learning with students and took them to the field to grow their own fruit and vegetable crops. And there's nothing as rewarding as watching a student pull a vegetable from a plant, or pull a vegetable from the ground that they grew, that they can now share with their friends and family. It's the full circle on food production and understanding how difficult it is to make a living doing this. So they enjoyed it, and I enjoyed teaching them. So let's talk a little bit about where these fruits and vegetables come from. I'm going to focus on tomato, but my first example is potato, a close relative of tomato. This is one of those crops that is a new world vegetable, was brought to Europe by explorers and then brought back to the New World. How many people knew that? Is that a common story for you? Okay, so tomato, similar to potato, tomato is a New World crop, right? We always think about, what country do we think about when we think about tomatoes? Italy, right? Like, oh, that must be where tomatoes originated, is from Italy. But not true. Tomatoes are a New World crop that, as people explored the world, they brought those crops back and tried them in their environment. In fact, when you look at vegetables, that's happening all the time when people were exploring. One of the motivations for exploration is, conquering new lands, but that's a pretty broad euphemism for bringing back wealth, not just monetary wealth, but also capturing new resources, that one of those resources being food, right? So food, spices, medicines, herbs, all of the things that drive people when the money is not as important as the potential new crop, because the crop equals dollars, right? So when we look at where people moved, you see the history of where crops also moved. And so as a vegetable production person, this is of great interest to me. If I'm going to understand where this crop is grown now, it would help me to understand where it came from and where we got this crop from originally. And I'm very thankful. Anybody know this guy? Anybody ever read about this guy? So back in the early 1900s, scientists were exploring the world looking for new crops. And Vavilov was a plant scientist in the Soviet Union who wandered the world, explored the world, looking for new crops that he could bring back to Russia to feed the Russian population, feed the Soviet population. If you've never heard of this guy, look him up. Has a really interesting history. Talk about getting crossways with your boss. So had a huge disagreement with his boss and ended up in a concentration camp in Russia. Later, only later, much later after his death, were his actual accomplishments made known to the people of Russia, to the people of the Soviet Union, and he's now celebrated as a hero. But what he did was, in that exploration for plants, he was the first person to really notice that there were concentrated areas in the world that had very close relatives to cultivated plants. So they're not cultivated, but they're wild relatives that are very closely related to our cultivated plants. And he named those places centers of origin. Now, why is that important? If you know the center of origin, or sometimes you might call it the center of diversity or center of domestication for those crops, you can harvest the wild relatives for better genetics in the plants that you want to cultivate. So think about how the world works. You have areas of the world that have high disease pressure. If I'm growing tomatoes and they're susceptible, but a wild relative is able to survive, maybe there's a gene I can pull from that wild relative, make a cross, and get a resistant tomato that will survive. And I'll show you lots of examples of that in just a second. But when you look at Vavilov's work, all of these crop species have centers of origin, centers of diversity that plant scientists like me and the faculty in my department can go to those places and pull those genes, right? Make crosses with those plants and try to introgress those genetics into this, from these wild species into our cultivated species. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of tomatoes. Sometimes when you look at places where those wild species exist, they coincide to places where people originally settled. People domesticated those plants and then moved from area to area, bringing that plant material with them. So I mentioned, we think of Italy when we think of tomatoes. It's not different than that. They went to a place that had high diversity for tomatoes. They saw that they could eat it, and they brought it with them back to the place where they were going to try to grow it in the future, right? So we're seeing it whenever you talk about people and migration, you're really talking about plants and migration, right? It's kind of like the same concept. It's not really all that clear with some species how they moved. For example, this is okra. Anybody like okra? Okra is a cool plant. But when we look at centers of diversity for okra, we actually see two areas on the globe that have really high wild species diversity for okra. And so it could mean that it had two centers of origin. It could mean that there was early movement between these areas. We just don't know. We don't know enough yet of the history of it. But lots and lots of diversity in both of those areas. So it's kind of interesting as a plant person to look at that. But you asked me not to talk about okra, but to talk about tomatoes. So let's talk about tomatoes. So is tomato anybody's favorite vegetable? Yeah. When you meet a passionate gardener, if they only grow one thing, they're going to grow tomatoes, right? Because it's the one thing that they feel like, if I can do this right, I can grow just about anything, right? The reason is because tomatoes have so much diversity. You know, everyone has a story about the ripe tomato and where they ate it and when they ate it and what they were doing when they grew it or encountered it, right? We all have that connectivity with this new world veggie. I put up a bunch of different varieties of tomatoes here because the visual diversity is so high in this crop. And you can find examples of all of these kinds of tomatoes either grown commercially or exchanged with home gardeners. A lot of diversity exists in this crop. And why are people passionate about it? Well, quite frankly, tomatoes are hot. People are really passionate about this vegetable. It has a lot of health benefits. It has a lot of taste benefits. It has a lot of diversity. Lots of good things come when you eat tomatoes. But at the same time, we've all had that experience where people who eat a bad tomato, it sticks with you. I don't know if anybody was in the room when Sheila and I were chatting, but you know, the tomatoes that we grow in the winter in Florida are often picked green like this. They're gassed on their way to the supermarket, and by the time they get to the supermarket, they've turned kind of a pinkish red, right? And those markets up there are hungry for them because they have no other red tomatoes available, right? So they'll take our pink doorknobs in the winter from Florida and pay a premium for them because there's nothing else, right? And we're lucky that they do that because they fuel our economy. But when you look at what consumers prefer, it's definitely not that gas green tomato that kind of has made Florida famous. In fact, what consumers want is a little more diversity like we see here, right? These heirloom types and different colors. One of the things that has happened in the last 10 years in our department especially is looking at what makes tomato flavor a tomato flavorful. How do we as consumers determine that tomato flavor? What is tomato flavor? And how can we then link that back to the genetics of the plant in order to breed for tomatoes that have better flavor? So that's really our goal, right? Is to drive the production towards what consumers will accept, right? In the past, it would have been to drive production towards tomatoes that will ship from Florida to New York City in the back of a truck. But now people are demanding better tomato flavor. So we need a durable tomato that has enhanced flavor, right? Better flavor. And you can, depending on what your profile is, what your taste profile is, you can find a tomato that will just about fit everybody's need. Anybody here on a low acid diet? You're trying to avoid acidic foods. There are tomatoes now that have low acid, right? There are tomatoes that are extra sweet. Anybody like grape tomatoes? Those really sweet, sugar sweet. You know, when you go to the grocery store now, they're marketed as extra sweet or Santa sweet, sugar sweet tomatoes. So lots and lots of options there that, you know, 20 years ago, certainly we wouldn't have seen any of that marketed in the grocery store. Color, shape, taste are now front and center for tomatoes. In fact, so many consumers have complained about those pink doorknobs that it's really driven the science towards that, even from the grower side, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so let's talk about breeding. So when I think about tomato botany, there's a lot of things that we can manipulate to make a better tomato. Let's talk a little bit about those. So here's one. Tomato has multiple kinds of flower structures, right? So you can have tomatoes that are single fruited, kind of like this single flower standalone. You can have them where they have multiple flowers on a cluster. You can have them where they have many, many clusters of flowers together, right? And so all of these structures exist in tomatoes in wild relatives. So if we were interested, for example, in pulling in multiple tomato flowers into a commercial variety, we would try to breed this variety, cross it with our commercial tomatoes, and then introgress this trait, select for this trait, and bring it into our commercial varieties. The problem with that, of course, is there's lots of other genetics besides this flower structure that come with that cross. And so you've got to back cross to get back to the fruit size you want, the fruit shape you want, but retain this. So you can imagine the amount of selection that goes into trying to make that cross and then keep it as you back cross to get close to something that's commercially marketable. When you look at flower structures as a plant person, what I'm seeing when I look at these flower structures is really what's the fruiting pattern that's going to be resultant from those flower structures. So for example, you can imagine those big panicles of flowers, big clusters of flowers producing very close fruit, very close together. What's a drawback, do you think, of having fruit like this? Yeah, the weight of it. You could actually break the stem that's holding up the fruit, right? What else? You could have disease because you might have high humidity, stinky diseases hanging around in this. Anything else? Look how big these guys are. Think you might get some crowding, right? So maybe your shape uniformity might be off. Maybe the size overall would be smaller because there's just not physically enough resources or room, right? Alternatively, look at this shape. Can you imagine how you would market this if you were a farmer, right? Think about like an eggshell, you know, an egg box that has a perfect niche for each of these little dainty tomatoes that you're going to charge a premium for, right? Hopefully they're delicious and easily marketable. So anybody ever seen a plant like this? Anybody ever grow this? What is it? Do you know? Celosia, yeah. So what's the alternative? What's a common name for celosia? Coxcomb, yeah, very good, coxcomb. So in this case, this is the normal coxcomb shape. This is how the flowers normally grow. But sometimes you can find them where they're growing like this. Anybody know what this one's called? Celosia cerebrum. It's like a little brain. Yeah. So plant people, you know, this is not rocket science, right? This is plant science. So they named it like a brain, cerebrum. So this kind of flowering pattern has a name. It's called fasciated. And we can see that in tomato flowers. Normally, when we think about tomato flowers, they should look like this. They should have 5 petals, right? Normal shape, round. When the fruit develops, when this flower gets pollinated and the fruit develops, you can see the remnants of that flower right here at the end, this little tiny round blossom scar. This is where the flower used to be. And then this ovary, which is beneath these petals, swells up and becomes the fruit. But if you had a flower like this, which is the same as that cerebrum callosea, that brain, look at how many extra petals, look at how many extra pistils and flower parts are associated with this. This can occur in nature. It's a natural variation. And when this thing pollinates and sets fruit, you often get different sizes and shapes of fruit. So if you have eaten an heirloom tomato that has kind of a wonky shape and you flip it over and it has a great big blossom scar like this, it probably came from a flower that was fasciated like this. Bigger size, different shapes, right? But you can imagine commercially, this would be a no-go, right? Because think about this. This is an opening directly into the fruit. So any disease that lands on this fruit and gets blown into that opening, there's food, there's water, there's the ideal environment, it's going to go nuts and rot that fruit, right? So growers have selected away from this because this little opening is much easier to defend than this great big opening. But this great big opening might have other benefits, flavor, taste, shape, all those things. So let's look at a little bit of shape. Normally, when we think about tomatoes, the wild type tomatoes have a small round fruit, small red round fruit, right? But we can look at the genetics of the tomato based on the shapes that we see in nature, and we can find out which genes control the size of that locule. So the locule is the part that's full of jelly and has the seeds. So if I want a big fruit, I need a big locule, right? So if I want to increase from cherry tomato size to beefsteak tomato size, I've got to have a fruit that has this locule gene because it's going to make my fruit big, right? If I wanted a fruit that was heart-shaped or elongated, right, I'd need to have this ovate gene, okay? If I wanted it to be that kind of typical heirloom type where it's a great big beefsteak fruit, really wide fruit, I might try to find that fasciated gene and incorporate that in the mix, right? And we can see these in lots and lots of commercial varieties when we look at them from the marketplace. So everything from that sort of like flat shape that you might associate with heirlooms to the typical round winter market fruit that we grow commercially. Ox hearts, anybody eat these ox hearts? This ox heart shaped fruit? Have you seen that in the market? So the ox heart shapes, lots of people would in the past would grow them because they have high solids contents. They would use them for canning, making sauces and things like that. And then all the way down to these more what I would call European types, which are selected away. These are the, San Marzano, that kind of type that are famous there. So now we've talked about pattern of flowering, we've talked about shapes of fruit. Let's talk about color of fruit because, as a consumer, this is what's going to draw you over to that table to buy this tomato. And when we look at variability, we can find everything from mature seeded tomatoes that remain green all the way through to what we would traditionally call a red fruited variety and everything in between, right? So we can find black tomatoes. These are tomatoes that maintain chlorophyll and this anthocyanin and this red pigment. So when you mix that together, you get that chocolate colored fruit, right? Anybody ever eat one of those? Tastes like tomatoes? Yeah. Even though they're marketed as chocolate, they do taste just like tomatoes. And everything in between. So we can look at either pigment color, we can look at things like orange fruit that have low acid. So now as a signal to consumers, you can say this fruit that's orange has low acid. So instead of a consumer walking up and asking for, I need tomatoes, are they low acid? The consumer can say, oh, I'm gonna pick one of these orange fruited varieties because they tend to be lower in acid. Lots and lots of variability like that. And then multiple colors within the same fruit is also not uncommon, especially in heirloom varieties. So that's flesh color. You can also get skin color variation. So anybody ever eat tomatoes like these? There's a really famous heirloom variety called Mr. Stripey, right? And it has this kind of orange flesh inside and yellow flesh on the outside. And then a lot of variation in stripes on the exterior of the fruit. So these don't go into the fruit, but they are very dramatic, lots of patterning on the outside, really, really attractive, especially if you had a big pile of them at your table that you were trying to draw customers over. You know, this is going to draw a customer over because it's so unusual. So we can understand now the genetics of this and bring this into the commercial varieties that we're selecting for. That's important because remember, we're selecting those commercial varieties for disease resistance, high productivity, you know, good fruit size, but we also still want to be mindful that people eat with their eyes first. So if we can draw them in with a color or a pattern like this, we can get them to purchase, try it out and see if they like it. The other thing that's unique about tomatoes is not just skin color, but actually the skin type can be genetically controlled or genetically changed. And you can go from a yellow outer skin color, more yellow pigment, to a clear, non-pigmented skin. So whatever that flesh color is really shines through, through on the outside. So I've talked a lot about genes, but what does this mean practically, like to a farmer? So one of the problems that tomato growers have, anybody who's grown tomatoes, have you ever seen this? Fruit cracking. So what's happening here? Do you know? Bad luck. Bad luck. Someone's messing with you. So what's really happening here from the physiology of the plant standpoint is tomatoes, when they're expanding, are loose. The skin is loose. The cells are loose. They're able to continue to pump water into those cells and get bigger and bigger. The problem is if you turn off the water, or let's say it doesn't rain for a few days, the plant gets the signal that no more water is available. I'm going to start solidifying that fruit. It's time to stop growing, stop expanding, and instead solidify my cell walls. If you come back and you turn the water back on, you start to increase that internal pressure again inside the fruit, and the result is this radial cracking like this. Very, very common, especially for people who, let's say you leave on the weekend and don't water your babies. Then you come back and your plants are wilted and you say, gosh, I got to turn the water back on. A few days later, you start to see fruit crack appear. And it's because they've stopped growing, and then you turn the water back on, they start expanding again. Really, really common. But what if we could improve the elasticity of that skin genetically and keep them from cracking as easily? That might be a trait that would be beneficial, right? How are we doing on time? Good? Okay. Okay, so I want to walk you through some of the science that we're doing, or that at least that I'm interested in, that you might also find interesting. And I mentioned that there are areas of the world that have high centers of diversity. If you think about it, those are the areas where there's a real arms race between plants and plant diseases happening, right? Anywhere where you have plants that are evolving, co-evolving with the disease, the ones that live are the ones that can outcompete the diseases that want to kill them, right? Here's one example for commercial growers. This is bacterial wilt. This is a real challenging disease for farmers. And you can see that if you have this soil-borne bacteria in your field, all of your plants are going to die. No resistance is available to this genetically. How are we going to grow tomatoes in this field? You're pretty much done growing tomatoes here because there's no resistance available. How are you going to do it? what if we could use an ancient technique, take the roots of a resistant tomato and graft onto the top of them the plant material that we want to grow? And in fact, that's what is happening globally because there's no good genetic resistance to this disease. Farmers are growing seedlings that are resistant roots and grafting them onto plants that have desirable tops, desirable scions. And it's helping with lots of things. This is root knot nematode. This is another challenging disease. But the idea is I can now choose what soil-borne problems I have, and I can match that up with the scion material, the tops of the plants that I want, graft them together and grow them in areas where I couldn't grow them before, right? As you can imagine, this is twice as expensive, right? You're now growing 2 plants. You need 2 greenhouses to grow those seedlings. You have to train somebody to graft. But if the choice is grafted plants that have resistant roots and ungrafted plants, that may just be the cost of doing business in areas where tomatoes have this disease susceptibility. Dramatic, right? You're in business one day, you're out of business the next day. And you can imagine if you didn't have these grafted plants, this farm would be done with tomatoes, growing something else, hopefully. And I mentioned, you know, I'm an extension person, so I've got to put out there this information for farmers. How are they going to do it? Create videos, you know, share information, share success stories, suppliers, and things like that. So, okay, I'm going to give you one more tomato example, and then I'll take any questions you have. So I mentioned roots. I'm sort of interested in roots, and roots are really hard to study because they're growing in the soil. Every time you try to dig a root out of the soil, you end up destroying the roots as you try to wash them off. So if you're going to look at the roots, you need a method to use to look at roots. And why do we care about that? Well, roots are the source of uptake, not only for water, but also for mineral nutrients. So I mentioned potassium earlier. In this case, I was very interested in looking at phosphorus, which is an immobile element. And we have a lot of it in the soil, but it's hard for the plants to mine. If I could build a better root system, could I increase the quality of the plants that I'm producing? So here's how we did it. We grew them in kitty litter. Anybody have a cat? Right? What's kitty litter? Kitty litter is essentially clay. It's inert, and you can wash it off the roots. So you germinate the plant, and then you can wash away the kitty litter without destroying the roots. Then you have to have a way to visualize that. How do I measure that as a scientist? You know, there's a lot of roots here. How do I measure it, right? So I did what every scientist does. I asked a grad student to do this. And the grad student was a genius, and he came up with a method to extract the kitty litter, maintain the root system, and then dye the roots so that they could be visualized. So we dipped those roots in a red dye, and then, believe it or not, we put them on a flatbed scanner with a water bath. And we scanned the roots through that water, and because they were red, we could easily pick them out optically with a camera sorter, and then ask the computer, tell me how many roots, how long are the roots, how wide are the roots, right? And use that as a method to characterize root systems across many, many tomato varieties. And we did that with commercial tomatoes as well as wild relatives. And these are, I mentioned at the beginning, these wild relatives that are closely related. And the idea was, could we make a cross between a wild relative and tomato that had better roots and see some improvement? I was lucky to work with good students. When we did this work, we started doing it in tomato and looking for not just phosphorus uptake, but hardiness to cold. So could we plant earlier when soil temperatures were lower? And I think that was kind of, I'll leave it there as far as what we found, but the idea was many, many potential benefits just from root enhancement, right? I mentioned I shared my passion for veggies. I hope I've shared a little bit of that passion with you. I'm very interested in this topic and passing that on, not just to my students, but to you. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Chris, that was just fascinating. I never knew there were that many types of tomatoes and that many issues. I think one can understand why you love what you do. I want to begin with a quick question myself, and that is a couple of years ago, maybe before your time at UF, IFAS was advertising a new tasty tomato. I
Yes.
think it was called Tasty Lee.
Tasty Lee.
But, and I went to the grocery store, I saw it in public, saw the name on it, bought it, and I didn't notice any improved flavor. 'Cause whatever happened to that tomato variety?
Well, there's a long story there, but it is a variety that has two unique genes that enhance flavor. One of them is called the crimson gene, and it improves the color, but along with it, it improves the anthocyanin content. And then it does have some enhanced flavor genetics that it was bred for. The challenge is, like many people, when you get something that's novel and people are starting to get interested in it, if you don't maintain that strict quality selection, less scrupulous players can enter the market and start undercutting the quality. And that's, I think, a little bit what happened with
Okay.
that one. Yeah, got a little bit of non-Tasty Lee tomatoes in those packages. And you know, you guys know this as well as I do. It only takes one bad review to ruin your reputation, right? So it can go away quickly if you don't protect your brand.
Oh, thank you. I'll take audience questions in a minute, but I do see a question online that says, a few years ago, I got tomato seed from UF for a tomato hybridized for good taste. How can I get some more seed?
Oh yeah, you can email me and I will connect you with the dealers that have those seeds. We still do that. Yep, there's a lot of that still in our department. Lots and lots of, in our department, we're breeding not just tomatoes, but gosh, every vegetable feels like, and fruit. And so lots of people who have gardens want to get UF varieties because they know they're good quality, and we maintain a list of all the varieties and where you can purchase them. Yeah, what nursery or seed company has those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, it's very good. I have noted with some friends who used to be grad students of mine in IFAS that we've lost most of our red maples out of our forest areas. That's more my field. But we're getting climate change, and I want to know what research is being done. Do we have to change the vegetables altogether, or are we able to breed them to be able to deal with the climate change?
Well, first we need to all be on the same page about that there is climate change, right? If we can speak the same language, we can make a difference in that area. One thing that we are doing to help adapt is we're noticing, and keep in mind, we're not only breeding vegetables, annualized crops in horticulture, but we're also breeding tree fruits. So early on, our peach industry, for example, was located around the Orlando area and south. But over the 30 years our peach breeders have been working, that production area that gets enough hours of chilling has moved further and further north. So originally they were breeding for Central Florida. Now they're breeding for kind of north central Gainesville, Ocala, those areas. And so farmers adapt those varieties, either existing varieties or production areas, to meet those new demands. Anybody live here in the 80s? So in the 80s, this area was known for citrus production, but we had two hard freezes, 85 and 87, dramatically hard freezes. So just about the time farmers replanted citrus, another hard freeze killed their trees again. And so they moved that production south. Now, if you drive to North Florida, you'll see citrus production again, because growers are pushing that kind of like production limit again up to the northern part of the state. So it's variable, and also how we're dealing with it genetically changes. So yes, we're working on those varieties that are adapted to new climates, and we're also working on new production areas that are adapted to the same climate, but is now in a different zone. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take another question from the audience, and then I see two on the screen.
Enjoyed your talk. Any efforts to breed a perennial tomato?
Oh, yeah. So you must have have you been to the land? Have you seen the giant tomato tree that is growing in Disney? Yeah. So so in their native environment, tomatoes can be perennialized. So they'll start to develop a little bit woodier stem. They'll last multiple years, but they don't experience this hard freezes there in Central America that we would here. So the idea is if you can keep it alive, it can be multi-year crop already. And in that, I mentioned the land. So there's a big tomato tree, and it has, it's a multiple stemmed monster growing in the land area in Epcot. It's pretty cool if you haven't seen it.
Okay, I've got a question from the web. Good to know the yellow woody characteristics are not a disease, but a soil deficiency. Your map of productivity in the world does not show Florida. Why not?
I'm not sure which map of productivity it was, but in terms of the adaptation, the best part about growing horticultural crops in Florida is we're adapted all the way from the 30 degrees south to 30 degrees north. So anywhere that in that central part of the world that a plant can grow, it's going to grow in Florida. So we're lucky in that sense. Our breeders who are growing, for example, for adaptation for blueberries here can hit blueberry production in Mexico and Brazil and lots of other places as well. So it's a big zone for which matches Florida climate.
How does hydroponics change tomato production?
Oh, nice. So, well, the first thing it does is make it expensive because it's a completely controlled environment, high management, right? That usually means skilled employees and high technology and a little more cost. What it does do is increase that production cycling. So I can get more than one crop per year. I'm not out of production. Usually I have less disease and insect pressure because I can control better what goes into the greenhouse or the container now. Sometimes these are grown completely without natural light, grown in artificial light. One of the most interesting things about that is it usually means you can grow them in places that don't traditionally have food production. So think of a very urban environment where, proximity to land for production is very distant. You can drop one of these containers that's self-sufficient into that area. They use very little water, but they also return produce directly to that neighboring environment. So get people involved in where their food comes from, hopefully increase their choices, get them to make better food choices.
Okay.
I have a very basic question.
Okay.
You look at most vegetables, they're green, and tomatoes stand out as red. Now, first sense is, what makes them red? And is this ingredient something that has some particular value for us?
Mhm. Yeah, in fact, the red pigment is due to lycopene in those tomatoes, and that lycopene has wonderful health benefits, lowers your blood pressure, right? It's a absorber of free radicals. So, when you have these free radical species floating around in you that are going to cause damage, these lycopene molecules can absorb some of those. So yeah, it's the thing that exists in watermelon, all those red vegetables, watermelon, tomatoes, all have high lycopene.
Question from the web. How important is eating organic tomatoes versus conventional? If we can't get organic, should we skin conventional tomatoes?
So this is a little bit of philosophy. So you're going to get Dr. Gunter's philosophy. If you are not eating tomatoes and all you can afford are conventional tomatoes, buy conventional tomatoes, because I think the The challenge is if you have unlimited resources and access to organic, buy the best, highest quality produce, but most importantly, eat more produce, right? So if you have access to organic and can afford organic, buy that. But if you don't, and the choice is, I'm going to buy conventional and eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more fruits and vegetables. That's the 800-pound gorilla in the room when we have this conversation. If someone is turning away from fresh fruit and vegetable consumption because it was produced with conventional pesticides and chemicals, how sad is that they're making a health choice that's so long-term that they could make much better choices in what they're eating, right? If we all had the luxury to buy from Whole Foods, do that. But most of the folks that you encounter don't have that luxury. And they're hearing that message that I must buy organic or don't buy it. Big problem. I think increasing our consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables is the thing that's going to lead us out of the health epidemic that we have now. And I think that's the way to phrase that. If you can, buy the best you can.
Okay, I thought I had another question up front here. I do.
you. What kind of tomatoes can we buy, excuse me, buy locally to get flavor?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would talk to you, if you go to the farmer's market, I would talk to your farmer and I would say, look, my primary goal is to buy for flavor. I want to know when these tomatoes are ripe. I want to know when the highest quality is going to be available and then buy. If flavor is the primary concern, because even our gas green tomatoes that are in the supermarket, if they were allowed to ripen on the vine, would taste completely different than these pink doorknobs that we're used to. But we don't have the luxury of getting those to market in the ripest stage. So our goal is to shipping for those. But when you're buying directly from the farmer, you can say, I don't want to buy them half ripe, partially ripe. I want to buy them when they're fully ripe. So when is that? When can I get them from you when they're fully ripe? Yeah.
Okay,
course
here's
you
a
can
chance. Excuse me.
go your own.
One more question. Okay, Chris, that was absolutely fascinating. Really enjoyed it. Maybe you could just tell us your email
Oh yeah.
address or put it up. Can you put it up, Pam, on
Yeah.
on the screen if folks want to communicate with you?
It's on that, should be on that very first slide. Yeah,
Yeah, there it is. Should be.
there you go.
Okay, there you are.
Yep.
Yeah, at the bottom.
Yeah, and those of you who want to buy, Florida seeds, shoot me an email and I'll send you the list of the seeds and seed producers that are out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very nice to meet everyone.